This is the Evergreen Empire.
Green grow the forests and fair flow the streams. The gentle deer grazes, the wild blossom gleams. From ocean wave raging to mountain serene, all nature's proclaiming our land's evergreen.
Welcome to Columbia Conversations. I'm Feliks Banel, editor of Columbia Magazine for the Washington State Historical Society. On this episode, we speak with Essex Porter, who retired recently after a nearly 40-year career as a journalist for KIRO TV News in Seattle. From the early 1980s until 2021, Essex Porter witnessed a lot of history.
That stunned people that you could actually build a building that tall in Seattle. What the heck is going on here?
We spoke by phone in February 2022. Essex Porter, thanks for joining us for this episode of Columbia Conversations. You've had a long career as a journalist in Seattle. For those who may not be as familiar with your work because maybe they don't live in the area or they're relatively new to town, can you give us a brief sketch of what your journalism career consisted of here in Seattle?
Well, I came to Seattle from Portland and started in September of 1982 at KIRO TV Channel 7. During that time, I've been a reporter. I've been co-anchor of the morning news. I was the first East Side bureau chief. I was the anchor of what we called the Puget Sound Business Report for a time. I've worked every single shift, including graveyard. And I have covered all kinds of stories, but I focused as much as I could on politics and government. I've interviewed every Seattle mayor or ex-mayor since Wes Ullman, and I have interviewed every governor or ex-governor since Dick Seeley-Ray.
I mean, this is kind of a dumb question, but I often find that journalists, especially career journalists like yourself, the overlap between someone who does day-to-day reporting on what's going on and the interest and knowledge of broader history and context that gets us to where we are today or where we might be headed tomorrow. Is that true for you? Are you a history guy as well?
I am a history guy, certainly not steeped in it as much as you are. And I didn't grow up in Washington, so I don't know a ton of Washington history. I know some, but, it's very, you do see the parallels, and it's, it can, it's if you haven't lived the history, it can be a little harder to see, but, some of the same struggles we have now, we faced, shaped maybe a little differently, but the basic struggles are the same.
And you said you were in Portland before. Where did you grow up, and when did you first move to Portland?
I'm a military kid. I am a native of Chicago, but I did not grow up there. My dad was in the Army, so I did a lot of growing up on Okinawa, Japan. We had 2 tours there. I did a lot of growing up in Junction City, Fort Riley, Kansas. We had a couple of tours there. And I was lucky to spend my senior year in high school when we were assigned to Hawaii. So I'm a graduate of Radford High School in Hawaii. That's the high school that serves the Pearl Harbor Navy base.
Wow. And so when you came to Seattle in 1982, how old were you?
That's a really good question. I have to do the math. I was fairly young, certainly much younger, but you're asking a reporter to do math here. They said there'd be no math. That's why we got into reporting.
Yeah. What did attract you to journalism?
Oh, just that sense of being there when history is made. I think that's the first thing. I was always interested in public affairs and history as a student. And the great events would happen. I've told this story on Twitter a few times, but I was a second grader in Kansas the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. And, back then they would let second graders walk maybe a third of a mile or whatever, home by themselves, have lunch at home, and then walk back to school. And my mom was working, so I was a latchkey kid. I'd walk home, I'd have my lunch, I'd watch some television. I remember the bulletin slide from CBS News. That was the one station we got really clearly at that time, those days before cable. And I didn't want to be late for school, so I left before they announced that President Kennedy had been killed. I didn't find out until I'd gotten back to school. And all that weekend, my family and I, we watched the coverage. The station we could get was the CBS station. We loved Walter Cronkite anyway. We watched all of his coverage. Federal employees had the day off that Monday so that the nation could watch the funeral. And I didn't know it then really, because I really wanted to be a scientist, but I think that's where the seed was planted.
Yeah, you are a history guy. I got news. I mean, that's exactly that we're describing, that wanting to be there to sort of talk about things that are happening and being aware of the import and the weight of things, especially when you're that young in age. I've talked to so many journalists who get that kind of, maybe they get it from their parents or something, but they're exposed to some big world event or national event, and it just sort of charts the path for wanting to be involved in sharing those stories. So that's a great origin story. It makes perfect sense to me. So Seattle, 1982. Let me ask one of my big dumb questions. What was Seattle like in 1982 for you, an African-American guy coming to town as a journalist?
Well, to me, as an African-American guy, Seattle was no more or less open than any other place that I had experienced. I did not experience, overt discrimination, overt racism. Now, frankly, as a defense mechanism, and former CBS correspondent Ed Bradley talked about this in a visit to Seattle. You can see something as a Black person that will make you angry every day. And if you react to every single thing, you will be completely crazy. So as a defense mechanism, I didn't react to everything I might have seen. Sometimes, my brain didn't even see it, even if it was happening. So, I felt, and I certainly felt welcome among my colleagues at KIRO. So, for me, the challenge was, meeting and getting to know some of the leaders and community members in the Black community here, so I could help tell their story. But that was the same thing for me in trying to learn some of the leaders and people in the multiple Asian communities that are here as well. I wanted to get to know people so that I could tell some of the stories that might not normally be on the agenda of a news department and a station, that was led by whites who might not just be thinking that there are other stories that need to be told.
And, in terms of your personal experiences here, especially in the early 80s when you first were here, did you ever get pushed back trying to do a story with overt racism?
No, not certainly not that I noticed. But again, I'm not always looking. It had to be pretty blatant for me to see it. No. People push back on telling stories because they didn't want the stories to be told. It wasn't yeah. The race of the reporter that was the problem. It was what they were doing in the story that was the problem.
It's that old sort of Mike Wallace is out in the driveway kind of effect.
Yeah, there was a lot more of that.
What about, Seattle in general? I mean, I was born in 1968, so I think I was 13 or 14 in 1982 when you first started reporting at KIRO TV, and I was a viewer. And my memory of Seattle in those days is, it's rotary dial phones. There's no cell phones. There's only a handful of TV stations because we didn't have cable, and there's radio stations and everything, and a couple of daily newspapers. In terms of the character or the personality, in that unique place you've been in for 40 years, watching the city grow and change and evolve as people move here and people move away, and money comes in through Microsoft and other technology, and Boeing leaves town, the headquarters leaves town anyway. Can you point to things and say, yeah, these things are different? These things have changed about the character of the city that I first came to in 1982?
Yeah, this was very much Emmitt Watson's city. That lesser Seattle thought. And it always struck me, remember, I'm not from here, so it always struck me that Seattle was the city that was very uncomfortable growing up. So, Seattle, one strain wanted prosperity, wanted to be a world-class city, and the other strain was like, does that mean things are going to have to change? And so there, and that tension made for a lot of the stories I really love to cover. One of the stories I covered was when the Columbia Tower was built. That stunned people that you could actually build a building that tall in Seattle. What the heck is going on here? So then there was an initiative to limit the size of skyscrapers. You remember that?
Boy, I hadn't thought about that for decades. I forgot completely about that, actually.
Yes, yeah, there was an initiative to limit the size of skyscrapers, and the initiative passed. So for a time, that's what put some of the limits on how high you could build, and then there were things you could add to a skyscraper, like a daycare center, to gain a few more floors, and it also led to the development of the high-rise apartments and condos that you see, especially in the Belltown area. So, but that was the kind of tension that I witnessed, that I covered in this city.
And for someone who might not know who Emmitt Watson was, can you describe Emmitt Watson and what Lesser Seattle represented from your perspective, sort of moving here when you did? Emmitt
Watson, and I want to be careful because I'm doing this from memory. But Emmitt Watson was a writer, a newspaper columnist who championed the idea that Seattle should not lose its special character as he saw it, the special character from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, as Seattle grew up. And so he was a proponent of growing slowly, and not inviting the world here to show up and bid up the price of houses and build skyscrapers for offices. And the whole movement was called Lesser Seattle. And I think some of that I'm sure was a bit of an exaggeration on his part, but he wanted to make people think of where we were going, what we were doing, what we might be giving up as Seattle changed.
It always seemed to me that Seattle was that, it was the people who were pushing for faster growth and that world city connection. It seems like those people pretty much triumphed and prevailed with things like the Goodwill Games here and with even the World's Fair way back in 1962.
Right.
But it seemed to me, and maybe tell me what you think about this, because you probably covered this. There was that time, I think it was around, I can't remember the year exactly, sometime around the year 2000, maybe a few years before that, where the city council killed the bid for the Olympics. That to me seemed like that's where Seattle officially is not trying to be this world-class city of the highest degree possible. There's too much trepidation or too much reluctance to try to do what an Olympics would do to this city, which isn't necessarily a good thing. I mean, it depends on your perspective. But I don't know if you remember that. Am I making more of a big deal than that actually was?
Yeah, I don't think so. But and again, memories can be fuzzy, so I'm not going to be precise on the timeline.
Of course.
But in that general timeline, the Goodwill Games had been an unexpected success here. I remember at KIRO Radio, back when KIRO Radio and KIRO TV were co-owned.
Mm-hmm.
KIRO Radio made a huge deal of extending traffic reports from the morning drive where they had always been to all-day traffic reports for fear that the Goodwill Games would clog all the traffic and people would need to know. And that's how we got all-day traffic reports. Well, it turned out there was no traffic. The Goodwill Games ran so well, it was great, but we kept the all-day traffic report.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're right.
And also, remember right around that time, we had the WTO meeting.
Yeah.
And WTO and those riots. So there got to be the feeling that, bringing the world to Seattle could be more expensive and troublesome than it might be worth.
Yeah.
And plus, even then, everybody knew that the Olympics simply is a major budget drainer for any city that takes it up, which is why almost no city's been on it anymore.
Yeah, and that's just for the bribes you're talking about now. So back to Emmitt Watson and back to 1982 versus 2022. Did Seattle lose its character? Has the city changed beyond where it should have changed or could have changed? Has it lost its way compared to 40 years ago?
I don't think Seattle has lost its way. But has it lost its character? Was there a single character to Seattle anyway? And, for some folks, I think Seattle has lost its character. For me personally, I always wanted to live in a big city. Seattle was the biggest city I'd ever had lived in. And I had always looked to the future, and, the icon Space Needle gives Seattle such a futuristic look. I always say I was a huge fan of that Jetsons cartoon.
Yep.
And the Space Needle looks just like the Jetsons, or the Jetsons looks just like the Space Needle. But for me, that's all great. There are definitely things that have been lost. I think the bigger problem is that as many have prospered here, many have been left behind, and it's tougher for many.
Yeah.
And if those who have been left behind were doing a little better, I think we would all be more comfortable with the changes that have come.
Yeah, nicely put. And I imagine there's stories that you probably covered again and again throughout those 40 years where there was little to no progress. TV journalism has changed quite a bit. For one sort of fluffy question before the deeper question, did they ever make you go and talk to the guys who set up couches out on 4th Avenue for the Torchlight Parade before the parade, like the day before?
Yes, I have talked to this.
That was always my favorite story. It was so predictable. Every summer there'd be the guys with the couches out on 4th Avenue, and I missed that kind of TV journalism. That seems like it's from a different time. Like, I don't think there's isn't necessarily the airtime for those kinds of stories anymore, because it's just there's so much other bad news, or things have sped up.
These days some of the news is a little more intense, so you don't necessarily get around to that.
Yeah.
When there are quiet periods for news, we love to cover the Torchlight Parade. I was pleased to be asked to be part of the Torchlight Parade. Actual live coverage.
Oh wow!
One year, got sprayed with silly string and the whole thing.
So how did TV news change in the time? Along with the technology, speeding up and getting smaller and lighter and faster, I guess. What changes did you witness in those 40 years of covering Seattle through a television camera?
Well, everything sped up for TV news too. When I came to Seattle, we were already using the electronic cameras, but when I started covering TV news, we were using film, and film slowed things down because you needed an hour or two to be sure the film could be processed in time for the news. You didn't do multiple newscasts spread throughout the day, and you certainly didn't go. You certainly didn't present your stories live from every venue. So the technology made it possible for news to be on all the time, for a local station to have multiple hours of news a day. And I don't think I can count quickly enough how many hours of news per day we have at Channel 7. But Channel 7 doesn't have as many hours of news per day as some of the other stations in town. But when the news is always on, there's less time to cover the more secondary stories, or to cover those stories that aren't the breaking biggest headlines of the day, because you are making sure that every one of those newscasts has the latest breaking content. And after you've spent your resources doing that, there's not much time to do much else. And that's not to say that there aren't, when you watch news here in Seattle, you do see in-depth reporting, you do see investigative reporting, but you don't always see sort of those stories that are in between that take more time, but aren't the hard-hitting investigative pieces.
Yeah. And then, I imagine 40 years ago, I know 40 years ago, you weren't having to then go do your Twitter feed or your Facebook or your social media posts. You had this TV story to produce, and then next day you do another one, I assume, right? It's like there's so much more. This 24-hour availability and 24-hour news cycle now has completely changed the nature of the business in a way that, on one hand, is pretty exciting and pretty cool from just the constant stream of news if you want it. But I imagine as a working journalist, it's probably exhausting or feels exhausting at times.
Well, it does. It never really ends. You are, even if you are not presenting something on the air or online, you're always thinking about it. You're always perhaps seeing another story around the corner, or seeing another facet of the story you covered that day that you didn't get in that day's report. Maybe now you're off work, but hey, that's an interesting thing. Let me tweet about that a little bit, or let me rewrite that paragraph in the online story and ask the online editors to add this to what we've done. So yeah, it's there always was 24-hour news, but now you can do 24-hour news.
Now, were there people at KIRO TV? I'm trying to remember who was even the core network, the anchor team in the early 80s. Were there people there who kind of became your mentor, or were sort of these old-time figures in TV news that we might recognize their names now? They're not on the air anymore, but who sort of helped you early in your career and kind of functioned as a mentor in your early years?
There were informal mentors all around, and it's one person who really helped. You'll recall KIRO 7 anchor Gary Justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gary Justice was instrumental in hiring me from Portland, and we didn't sit around and talk about the ins and outs of journalism or whatever, but Gary might see something or say something that would make me think about how things are being done, or how we could approach a story differently, or might have a perspective that I hadn't actually noticed. So there were encounters like that. There were people who were helpful on an ad hoc basis, maybe with a particular issue or a particular perspective, and you just never knew when it would happen.
Yeah. I've worked in a few newsrooms. I've never really worked full time. My stuff's always been fairly part time, but there's a sense in a solid TV newsroom or a radio newsroom where people like and respect each other. It feels like that comes across in the product, in the broadcast, whether it's TV or radio, whether the people like each other and trust each other. And that seems like that's been really key. And that seems like that was certainly present in those old days at KIRO TV. And it seems like it's still present there in the stations where you can just tell. I mean, and that's kind of an outsider's perspective. Is that roughly true, do you think, in your experience? Or
I definitely think the audience can tell, especially for the reporters and anchors they see all the time. They can, just like when you go into a grocery store, you can tell if there are good bosses and if the staff likes and helps each other out. You'll know what the working situation is like just by the way you see them treat each other and you see them treat you. And when you step into a happy workplace or a happier workplace. And it's the same thing. A television newsroom may never be a happy workplace because everybody's working really hard, and so it may be not amongst the happiest workplaces. There is a lot of pressure, but you can tell, and you can tell when a workplace is not a good TV news workplace. I've had a lot of bosses, and even though I worked at the same building for nearly 40 years, there's been 4 different companies. So and some of these situations have been happier than others. I'll just put it that way. By the way, and dropping, no, not to drop too big of a hint. The KIRO 7 I retired from, it's an absolutely great place to work with great people, and I do miss it.
Excellent. Now, one question in terms of and I'll let you. You've been really generous with your time. Any really nightmarish interviews where you can sort of describe it without maybe naming the person, but kind of leaving it up to us to guess, and kind of maybe you had to interview the person multiple times. Maybe they were an elected official or some kind of a big wig or something that they were just sort of notoriously difficult to get in touch with or to get information out of.
Boy, that is a tough question. I think of something. It's kind of something similar to what quarterback Russell Wilson says. That you have to have a short memory. You threw an interception. That was last year, even though it was 2 minutes ago, and now you got to go out and somehow get the team back to a touchdown, right? So, I don't know that there were any unbelievably awful, terrible interviews. And there are people who, there are definitely people who didn't want to answer questions, wanted to talk around questions, didn't want to clarify their positions. But those weren't necessarily bad interviews because the audience saw them squirm. The audience knew what was going on. And, I always like to say, it's not the questions that are the problem. It's the answers that are the problem. Questions aren't tough. The answers are tough, and the audience can tell. So, I will try to ask you direct questions and give you a chance to be clear. But if you don't want to take the chance, your answer's still going on TV.
Very nice. That's great. So what will you miss the most? I mean, I assume, are you doing anything in retirement related to journalism or anything like that? Or what are you going to do with all your spare time now?
Well, at the moment, I'm really trying to take care of home matters, but and I'm not, at the moment, I'm not teaching or anything like that. I'm staying active with the Seattle Association of Black Journalists, a great group of journalists, most of whom are much younger than I am, which is great. And so, staying active with them as we try to continue to connect with community and make sure that all voices are heard. And we'll see where things go from there. My contemporaries who have retired, like Connie Thompson from Como Channel 4, reminds me not to jump into anything big right away. Give it some time, let things settle, and we'll see what happens.
Well, congratulations on a great long career at KIRO TV. I will point out you were able to dodge the question about how old you were in 1982, so I'll congratulate you on dodging that question very well. But we can figure out, based on being in second grade in 1963, I think we can guess about your age. So anyway.
I'll let you guys figure it out. The only reason I dodged it is because I couldn't get my calculator on the phone quick enough while we were talking.
All right. Essex Porter, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Columbia Conversations, and congratulations again.
Admire your work, Felix, and the news stories that you have also led on, like the National Archives hearing.
Oh, thanks for saying. Thank you to Essex Porter for speaking with me for this episode of Columbia Conversations from the Washington State Historical Society. For more about Northwest journalism history, plan a visit to the Washington State History Museum during summer 2022 for News of the Day. It's an exhibit that examines how big events in Evergreen State history were covered by the media. Columbia is the quarterly magazine of Northwest history, reaching thousands of readers around the old Oregon country. To propose an article, to subscribe, or to give a gift subscription, please visit washingtonhistory.org. I'm Feliks Banel.